The day my stepmother told me I was not family was the day I finally started looking for the truth. My name is Rachel Bennett, and I was 67 years old when my father passed away. Losing him felt like losing the last person in the world who truly saw me. For weeks after the funeral, I moved through each day in a fog of grief, sorting old photographs, answering sympathy cards, and trying to adjust to a life that no longer included the man who had been my anchor since childhood. My father, Michael Bennett, was not a wealthy man by the standards of television dramas, but he was respected. He built a successful construction business, volunteered in the community, and never missed a family birthday. To me, however, he was simply Dad, the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle, how to balance a checkbook, and how to remain calm when life became difficult. After he married Diane nearly 30 years earlier, things changed. Not immediately. At first, she seemed pleasant enough. She smiled at family gatherings and spoke kindly when other people were around. But over time, I began to notice a pattern. Family vacations were planned without telling me. Holiday dinners were scheduled at times that conflicted with my work. Important conversations happened while I was somehow absent. Whenever I mentioned it to my father, he always found a gentle explanation. I wanted to believe him because I trusted him. The morning after the funeral service, several relatives gathered at my father's house. People stood in small groups drinking coffee and sharing memories. I was helping clear plates from the dining room when I overheard Diane speaking with two distant cousins. I was not trying to listen. Her words simply carried across the room. "Well," she said with a small laugh, "Rachel was never really part of this family anyway." The sentence hit me harder than I expected. One of the cousins looked uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject, but the damage was already done. I stood frozen beside the dining room table, holding a stack of plates. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I had heard her correctly. Never really part of this family. The words repeated in my mind for the rest of the day. Later that evening, I sat alone in my living room staring at an old photograph of my father and me taken nearly 40 years earlier at a county fair. We were both smiling. His arm rested proudly around my shoulder. Looking at that picture made Diane's comment seem even more absurd. How could anyone claim I was not family? Yet the more I thought about it, the more memories returned. Family events where I felt unwelcome. Decisions made without my knowledge. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. For years, I had dismissed those moments as misunderstandings. Now I was no longer certain. Over the next few days, Diane continued behaving as though nothing unusual had happened. She thanked people for attending the funeral. She discussed paperwork. She spoke confidently about family matters. Meanwhile, I found myself replaying her words again and again. Then, 3 days later, something unexpected happened. My Aunt Carol called and asked if she could stop by. She sounded nervous. When she arrived, she sat quietly at my kitchen table for several minutes before speaking. Finally, she looked at me and said something that changed everything. "Rachel," she said softly, "there are things about your past that you were never told." At that moment, I felt a chill run through me. Because deep down, I suddenly knew that Diane's cruel comment was not the beginning of the story. It was the first crack in a secret that had been hidden for decades. Aunt Carol sat quietly at my kitchen table, wrapping both hands around a coffee mug she had barely touched. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. For several moments, neither of us spoke. I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. Whatever she came to tell me was not something she had planned to say lightly. Finally, she looked directly at me. "Your father loved you more than anything," she said softly. "I need you to remember that before we talk about the rest." Her statement immediately caught my attention. It sounded less like a conversation and more like the beginning of a confession. I nodded but said nothing. Aunt Carol took a deep breath. "For years, I assumed Michael would eventually tell you himself." The room suddenly felt smaller. "Tell me what?" I asked. She hesitated. "I do not know the whole story," she admitted. "But I know enough to understand that some things about your early life were never explained properly." My stomach tightened. For 67 years, I believed I understood my family history. I knew my mother passed away when I was young. I knew my father raised me largely on his own before Diane entered our lives. There were gaps, of course. Every family has them. But I never imagined those gaps might hide something important. Aunt Carol leaned back in her chair and stared briefly out the window. "There were arguments years ago," she said. "Not loud arguments. Quiet ones. the kind people think children never notice. She explained that shortly after Diane married my father, disagreements began surrounding family records, old photographs, and personal documents. At the time, nobody understood why those items mattered so much. Looking back, Carol believed they were connected to something larger. I listened carefully, trying to process every word. The more she spoke, the more memories resurfaced. Boxes of papers that seemed to disappear. Family albums that were suddenly unavailable. Questions about my childhood that never received complete answers. None of those moments seemed important individually. Together, they formed a pattern I had never considered. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. Carol lowered her eyes for a moment. "Because of what Diane said after the funeral." The answer came immediately. "When she claimed you were never really family, something felt wrong. Very wrong." She paused. "And because your father spent years protecting something." Those words stayed with me. Protecting something. Not hiding it. Not creating it. Protecting it. The distinction mattered. As the conversation continued, Carol revealed one final detail. Several years earlier, while helping organize family records after a flood damaged part of the basement, she briefly saw documents she did not recognize. One document appeared to be an older version of a birth record. At the time, she paid little attention to it. She assumed it was simply paperwork. Now she was no longer certain. My heart began beating faster. "A birth record?" I repeated. Carol nodded slowly. "I only saw it for a few seconds. But I remember your father becoming unusually concerned when he realized those files had been moved." For the next hour, we discussed everything she could remember. Unfortunately, many details had faded over the years. There were no dramatic revelations. No complete answers. Only fragments. Yet those fragments were enough to change how I viewed my entire past. After Carol left, I remained at the kitchen table long into the evening. The house felt unusually quiet. My father's photograph sat on a nearby shelf, his familiar smile unchanged. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether the story I believed about my own life was incomplete. And if Aunt Carol was right, the answers might not be hidden in family memories at all. They might be waiting inside official records that nobody expected me to see. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I had not felt since before my father's funeral. For days, I had been moving through grief without direction, reacting to events rather than making decisions. Now, for the first time, I had a question that demanded an answer. If there was something hidden in my family's past, I intended to find it. After breakfast, I gathered the few personal documents I already possessed and spread them across my dining room table. Old tax records, insurance papers, a faded copy of my driver's license from decades earlier, several family photographs. I searched for anything connected to my birth or early childhood. To my disappointment, there was very little. My father had always handled important paperwork. Whenever documents were needed, he somehow knew exactly where to find them. Now that he was gone, I realized how much information had existed beyond my reach. Around noon, I drove to my father's house. Diane was not home. Her car was absent from the driveway, which suited me perfectly. I did not want a confrontation. Not yet. I wanted facts. Inside the house, everything looked almost exactly as it had before the funeral. The familiar furniture remained in place. Family photographs still lined the hallway walls. Yet the atmosphere felt different. The house no longer felt welcoming. It felt guarded. I walked carefully through the rooms, searching for any boxes or filing cabinets that might contain old records. Most of the obvious locations had already been organized after my father's passing. Several drawers sat nearly empty. Filing cabinets contained recent financial documents and routine household records. Nothing seemed unusual. Then I entered my father's study. The room immediately brought back memories. This was where he paid bills, balanced accounts, and handled every important responsibility for decades. His desk remained exactly as he left it. I sat in his chair and slowly opened each drawer. At first, I found nothing remarkable. Pens, envelopes, old receipts. Then, tucked behind a stack of folders, I discovered a small key taped beneath the underside of a drawer. My pulse quickened. The key was old and slightly worn. It clearly belonged somewhere. After several minutes of searching, I found a locked metal box hidden on a shelf inside a closet. The key fit perfectly. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Part of me felt guilty opening something my father never explicitly showed me. Another part remembered Aunt Carol's words. He had been protecting something. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the box. Inside were several folders, carefully organized and labeled in my father's handwriting. Most contained legal documents, property records, and family correspondence. Then one folder caught my attention immediately. Across the front, my father had written a single word. Rachel. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The contents were not what I expected. There were photographs from my childhood, school records, report cards, birthday cards, newspaper clippings. It looked more like a memory collection than an official file. Yet buried near the bottom sat a sealed envelope. On the front, my father had written another note. If questions ever arise, begin here. My heart began pounding. Questions had certainly arisen. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a handwritten note. The note was brief. My father instructed me to request a certified copy of my original birth record from the county archives. He emphasized one detail above everything else. Do not rely on family copies. Obtain the original record. I read the sentence 3 times. Why would he be so specific? As I sat alone in his study holding that note, one thing became clear. My father knew that someday I might start asking questions. More importantly, he already knew exactly where the answers were waiting. The following morning, I drove to the county records office located nearly 20 miles from my home. My father's note rested inside my purse the entire way there. I must have read it a dozen times since finding it in the locked box. The words remained simple and direct. Obtain the original record. Do not rely on family copies. The more I thought about that instruction, the more convinced I became that my father was trying to guide me towards something specific. He knew I would eventually ask questions. More importantly, he knew exactly where those questions should begin. The county records building was older than I expected. The brick exterior showed its age, but the inside was clean and well organized. After checking in at the front desk, I explained that I wanted to request a certified copy of my original birth record. The clerk handed me several forms and directed me to a waiting area. As I completed the paperwork, I felt strangely nervous. It seemed ridiculous. I had known my birthday my entire life. I knew where I was born. I knew my parents' names. At least I thought I did. Yet my father's note had planted a seed of doubt that refused to disappear. Nearly 40 minutes later, a woman introduced herself as Sarah Collins and invited me into a small office. She appeared professional and friendly, perhaps in her mid-50s, with years of experience helping people navigate government records. After reviewing my identification, she began searching the archive system. At first, everything seemed routine. Then I noticed her expression change. It was subtle. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the screen. She clicked through several records, paused, and then looked back at me. "Mrs. Bennett," she said carefully, "your file appears to contain additional documentation." My heart skipped a beat. Additional documentation? Sarah nodded. That is not unusual. Sometimes records include amendments, corrections, or supplemental filings. She spoke calmly, but something about her tone suggested there was more to the story. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a thin folder. Inside were certified copies of records connected to my birth registration. Sarah placed the documents on the desk and pointed toward one section. "This is the original filing information." I leaned forward and began reading. At first glance, everything looked familiar. My birth date matched what I had always known. The hospital was correct. The city was correct. Then I reached a section that made me stop. A notation appeared beside one of the entries. It indicated that the original record had been amended years after my birth. I looked up immediately. What does that mean? Sarah adjusted her glasses and reviewed the document. It means a legal modification was filed after the original certificate was issued. My pulse quickened. What kind of modification? She hesitated. The amended record should explain that. Slowly, I turned to the next page. The room suddenly felt very quiet. The amended certificate contained information that differed from every version of the document I had ever seen. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice immediately. Yet one detail stood out with unmistakable significance. A parental designation had been legally changed through a court-approved process many years earlier. I stared at the page, unable to fully process what I was seeing. The names were familiar, yet the timeline made no sense. According to the official record in front of me, a major legal update occurred when I was still a child. Why had nobody ever mentioned it? Why had my father hidden his concerns inside a locked box? Most importantly, Why did Diane spend years insisting that I was somehow less connected to the family when the government itself preserved a completely different version of the story? As Sarah quietly gathered additional files for review, I realized that my father's note had been right. The answers were here, but the first answer only revealed how many more questions remained. For several minutes I sat across from Sarah Collins, staring at the amended record. The document itself was not dramatic. There were no shocking headlines or bold declarations. Yet the legal notation changed everything I thought I knew about my own history. The amendment had been filed when I was 8 years old. More importantly, it was supported by a court order. That meant the change was not a clerical correction or a simple administrative update. It involved a formal legal proceeding. Sarah could see the confusion on my face. She patiently explained that amended birth records are created for many reasons. Some involve adoptions. Others reflect changes in parental status, custody matters, or court-recognized family relationships. Every situation is different. Her explanation was professional and neutral, but it raised far more questions than answers. "Can I obtain the supporting documents?" I asked. Sarah nodded. "Some records may require additional requests, but based on the file references, there should be archived court materials connected to this amendment." Hearing those words sent a wave of anticipation through me. For the first time, I felt as though I was standing near the edge of a truth my father had carefully protected for decades. Sarah helped me complete additional paperwork and submitted requests for the related files. While waiting, I reviewed the amended certificate again. One detail continued to stand out: the timeline. The legal change occurred years before Diane entered our lives. That fact alone immediately challenged the narrative she had promoted for so long. If she truly believed I was somehow less connected to the family, why did the official record point in the opposite direction? By late afternoon, Sarah returned with several archived references and summary records. Some materials would take additional time to retrieve, but enough information had surfaced to reveal a clearer picture. The amendment was linked to a family court proceeding initiated by my father, not by another relative, not by a government agency, by Michael Bennett himself. My heart tightened as I read the notation. Whatever happened, my father was directly involved. More importantly, he chose to make that legal change permanent. As Sarah continued reviewing the archive references, another unexpected detail appeared. Attached to one of the records was a list of supporting exhibits submitted during the proceeding. Most were routine legal documents. Then I noticed references to family correspondence and sworn statements. Sworn statements. The words immediately captured my attention. This was no minor administrative matter. People had provided testimony. Evidence had been reviewed. Decisions had been made. Yet somehow I reached 67 years old without knowing any of it existed. Driving home that evening, my thoughts returned repeatedly to my father. The note in the locked box now made perfect sense. He knew the official records contained answers. He also knew family memories could be altered, forgotten, or intentionally reshaped over time. Documents were different. Documents remained. When I arrived home, I spread copies of the records across my dining room table and began comparing dates. The more I examined them, the more a troubling pattern emerged. Several important family events occurred shortly after the amendment became official. Changes in living arrangements, shifts in family dynamics, conversations that suddenly made more sense when viewed through this new lens. Then I discovered something else. Tucked among the archive references was a case number connected to a sealed family court file. Sarah had mentioned that additional authorization might be required to access it. Yet the existence of the file itself told me something important. The real story was still hidden. The birth certificate revealed only the first layer. As the evening grew darker outside my windows, I stared at the case number written across the page. For decades, that file had quietly existed while Diane insisted I did not truly belong. Now I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere inside those court records was the reason my father spent years protecting a secret that could change everything. The next week felt longer than the previous month. Every morning, I checked my mailbox and email account hoping for an update regarding the sealed court file. Every afternoon, I found myself rereading my father's note and studying the records already in my possession. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that he had left a trail for me to follow. He never directly explained the secret. Instead, he carefully positioned the evidence where I would eventually find it. 7 days after my visit to the county office, Sarah Collins called. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something important had happened. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "the court has approved access to portions of the archived file." My heart immediately began racing. She explained that some materials remained restricted, but enough documentation had been released to establish the historical facts surrounding the amendment. We arranged a meeting for the following morning. I barely slept that night. Questions circled endlessly through my mind. Why did my father initiate legal proceedings when I was 8 years old? What was significant enough to require court involvement? And why had the truth remained hidden for nearly 6 decades? When I arrived at the records office the next morning, Sarah greeted me with a folder significantly thicker than the one I received during my previous visit. We sat together in a private review room. The atmosphere felt different this time, less administrative, more personal. Sarah opened the file and began organizing the documents chronologically. The first records established a timeline. Several years after my birth, legal questions arose concerning family status and parental recognition. Those questions eventually resulted in formal court proceedings initiated by my father. I continued reading carefully. Then I reached a sworn statement signed by Michael Bennett. Seeing my father's signature brought an unexpected wave of emotion. Even after all these years, I instantly recognized his handwriting. The statement itself was remarkably simple. My father declared that his relationship with me was permanent, unquestionable, and deserving of full legal protection. He argued that no future dispute should ever undermine my status within the family. I read the passage twice. Then a third time. My father was not trying to distance himself from me. He was doing the exact opposite. The next documents revealed why. Years earlier, circumstances involving extended family relationships had created uncertainty regarding inheritance rights and family recognition. Certain relatives questioned whether I should be treated differently from other family members. Rather than allow confusion to continue, my father took formal legal action to settle the matter permanently. As I absorbed that information, countless memories suddenly made sense. The occasional tension at family gatherings, conversations that stopped when children entered the room, expressions exchanged between adults when certain topics arose. I had witnessed the aftermath without ever understanding the cause. Then I discovered the most important document in the file. It was the final court order connected to the birth certificate amendment. The language was legal and technical, but its meaning was unmistakable. The court recognized my father's position completely. The amendment strengthened and formalized my standing within the family structure. Not weakened, not reduced, strengthened. I stared at the page in disbelief. For years, Diane implied I occupied some lesser place within the family. Yet the official records preserved exactly the opposite conclusion. A judge reviewed the evidence decades earlier and confirmed what my father had fought to establish. Sarah quietly allowed me time to process everything. Eventually, she pointed toward one final reference listed in the archive. It mentioned supporting family correspondence submitted during the proceedings. Most of the letters were unavailable, but one notation immediately caught my attention. According to the file summary, a written statement from a future family member strongly disagreed with my father's position. I felt a chill move through me. The date on the notation mattered, because the individual connected to that objection would later become my stepmother. And suddenly, for the first time, I began to understand how long this secret conflict had truly existed. After leaving the records office, I drove home in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not make any phone calls. My mind remained fixed on a single fact. Decades before Diane became my stepmother, she had already taken a position against something my father considered important enough to defend in court. The realization changed everything. For years, I believed the tension between us developed naturally over time. I assumed we simply had different personalities. Now I was beginning to suspect that the conflict started long before I ever recognized it. That evening, I returned to the folder from my father's locked box and reviewed every document again. This time I noticed details I had overlooked before. Several letters contained references to family unity, fairness, and protection. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly. My father seemed determined to ensure that no future misunderstanding could challenge my place within the family. Why would he be so concerned unless someone had already questioned it? The following afternoon, Aunt Carol came to visit again. When I explained what I had discovered, she listened quietly without interrupting. As I described the court order and the amendment to my birth record, I noticed a look of recognition cross her face. It was subtle, but impossible to miss. "You remember something?" I said. Carol sighed heavily. For a few seconds, she stared down at her hands before answering. More than I wanted to. Her response immediately captured my attention. She explained that years ago, shortly before Diane married my father, several private family discussions took place regarding inheritance planning and future family responsibilities. At the time, Carol paid little attention because she assumed the adults would resolve everything themselves. Looking back, however, she remembered one subject appearing repeatedly. Me. There were concerns about legal standing, Carol admitted carefully. At least that was how some people described it. My stomach tightened, and Diane was involved. Carol nodded slowly. Not publicly, but she had strong opinions. The room fell silent. Suddenly, dozens of small memories resurfaced. Comments Diane made over the years. The way she sometimes introduced me to distant relatives. Her tendency to describe me differently from other family members. None of it seemed significant at the time. Now every memory felt connected. Carol then revealed something that surprised me even more. According to her recollection, my father became increasingly protective whenever the subject arose. He rarely argued with relatives. He disliked conflict. Yet on this issue, he refused to compromise. "I remember him saying something once," Carol said quietly. "He told everyone that no matter what happened in the future, nobody would ever be allowed to erase your place in the family." Hearing those words nearly brought tears to my eyes. It sounded exactly like my father. Calm, determined, unwavering. After Carol left, I spent hours organizing timelines and documents across my dining room table. For the first time, the pieces began fitting together. The birth record amendment, the court order, the locked box, the hidden note, Diane's comment after the funeral. None of these events existed separately. They were chapters of the same story. Yet one crucial question remained unanswered. What exactly had my father fought so hard to protect? Late that night, while reviewing copies of the court file, I noticed a reference I had overlooked earlier. Attached to one archived document was a notation regarding supplemental family correspondence preserved outside the county records system. The notation included a location. My father's attorney. I stared at the page for several moments before realizing what it meant. If additional correspondence still existed, then the most important evidence might never have been stored in the courthouse at all. And somewhere inside those preserved letters, my father may have left the explanation he knew I would eventually need. 2 days later, I found myself sitting inside the office of the attorney who had represented my father years earlier. The original lawyer had retired, but the firm still existed and maintained archived records dating back decades. After several phone calls and a lengthy verification process, they agreed to review whether any family correspondence connected to the court proceedings remained in storage. I did not know what to expect. Part of me feared the records would be gone forever. Another part suspected my father anticipated this exact moment. The receptionist eventually escorted me into a conference room where a senior records manager placed a thin archival box on the table. These materials were preserved under a long-term retention request, he explained. Most clients do not make requests like this. My heart immediately quickened. That sounded exactly like something my father would do. Once I was alone, I carefully opened the box. Inside were several folders arranged chronologically. The earliest documents matched records I had already seen. Legal filings, correspondence summaries, administrative notes. Then I discovered a section labeled Family Statements. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The first letter came from my father. Reading his words felt almost like hearing his voice again. He described his commitment to protecting family stability and ensuring that no future misunderstandings could undermine established relationships. More importantly, he repeatedly emphasized one point. My place in the family was permanent, not conditional, not temporary, permanent. As I continued reading, the broader picture finally began to emerge. Years earlier, concerns had been raised regarding how future inheritance matters and family recognition might be interpreted. Certain individuals believed legal distinctions should exist. My father strongly disagreed. He argued that both the law and the family's moral obligations should recognize me fully and equally. Then I found the document that changed everything. It was a letter written during the legal proceedings by Diane. At the time, she was not yet my stepmother, but she was already involved in my father's life. The letter was polite, professional, careful, yet its message was unmistakable. Diane argued that future family arrangements should clearly distinguish between different categories of relatives. She repeatedly stressed the importance of defining who belonged and who did not. I sat frozen as I read the pages. There were no insults, no cruelty, nothing dramatic. Yet the underlying message mirrored exactly what she said after my father's funeral decades later. She had been expressing the same belief for nearly 30 years. Suddenly, years of confusing interactions made perfect sense. The distance, the exclusion, the subtle reminders that I occupied a different position. None of it began after she married my father. It existed from the very beginning. I continued reviewing the file until I reached the final document. It was my father's response. The letter was firm in a way I had rarely seen. He wrote that no future spouse, relative, or advisor would ever possess the authority to redefine his daughter or diminish her standing within the family. He specifically referenced the legal actions that resulted in the birth certificate amendment and court order. According to my father, those protections existed precisely to prevent future disputes. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the page. Not because I felt angry, not because I wanted revenge. I felt overwhelmed by the realization that my father spent years quietly defending me against challenges I never even knew existed. He never burdened me with the conflict. He simply solved the problem and preserved the evidence. As I carefully returned the letters to the archival box, one final thought settled into place. Diane's version of the story was not supported by memory, family tradition, or legal records. It was only an opinion she carried for decades. And now, for the first time, I possessed the documents proving my father spent years ensuring that opinion would never define who I was. When I returned home from the attorney's office, I carried the archival box to my dining room table and sat there for a long time without opening it again. The mystery that had consumed me for weeks was finally solved. The documents were clear. The court records were clear. My birth certificate was clear. Most importantly, my father's own words were clear. For decades, he had quietly protected my place in the family, not because it was uncertain, but because he knew some people would try to question it. As evening settled outside my windows, I spread the letters across the table one final time. I read my father's response again, paying attention to every sentence. What struck me most was not his determination. It was his confidence. He never sounded worried that the truth would fail. He never sounded afraid that someone else might prevail. He simply believed that facts mattered. He believed that documented truth would outlast opinions. In that moment, I finally understood why he left the note in the locked box instead of explaining everything directly. He knew that if questions ever arose, I would need evidence, not memories. A few days later, several relatives gathered for a family meeting that had originally been scheduled to discuss estate matters. Diane was there, seated near the end of the table. She looked exactly as she always had. Composed, confident, certain of her place in the room. Earlier in my life, I might have felt nervous. I might have worried about confrontation. This time was different. I no longer needed anyone's approval. I only needed the truth. During the conversation, family history eventually became part of the discussion. Someone mentioned the confusion that followed my father's funeral. Another relative referred to comments suggesting that I was somehow separate from the family. The room grew quiet. Without raising my voice, I placed copies of the court order, the amended birth record, and several archived letters on the table. Nobody spoke as the documents were passed from person to person. Several relatives examined the records carefully. Others focused on my father's letters. The longer they read, the more the atmosphere changed. Nobody argued with the documents. Nobody challenged the court order. Nobody disputed my father's intentions. The evidence spoke for itself. Diane remained silent. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed to understand that the story she repeated for years no longer carried any weight. The truth existed in writing. It existed in legal records. It existed in my father's own words. And unlike opinions, those things could be verified. As the meeting continued, several family members expressed surprise. Others admitted they had never known the full history. A few apologized for assumptions they made over the years. I appreciated their honesty, but something inside me had already changed. I realized I was no longer searching for validation. The journey began because someone questioned whether I belonged. It ended when I discovered that my belonging had been established long ago, long before the arguments, long before the misunderstandings, long before Diane entered the family. When the meeting concluded, I gathered the documents and prepared to leave. Before walking out, I glanced down at the final letter my father had written. One sentence stood out more than any other. He wrote that family is not defined by the opinions of others, but by the commitments people choose to honor. That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest gift my father left behind was not an inheritance. It was certainty. He spent years making sure that if anyone ever questioned who I was, the truth would be waiting. And in the end, a single birth